Zdravstvuyte, and welcome to episode 8 of my Soviet Union vlog. And this time we're going to be thinking about Stalin and his economic policies, and particularly this time about the causes of his industrialization and 5-year plan policies, and what happened in those first 5-year plans up to the Second World War. In the next episode, we'll crack on after the Second World War, obviously up to 1953, and we'll start to consider some of the change and continuity aspects of this. Remember that you're not going to get asked questions that ask about a particular 5-year plan because of the 10-year rule in the Edexcel exams. In the breadth studies, the essay can only span a minimum, that's right, minimum of 10 years. So you're going to be asked perhaps comparative questions. You're going to be asked perhaps about change over time, change continuity, and you might be asked cause questions, as we said. So let's start with that. Stalin's motivations for what's called the Great Turn economically from 1928 are obviously mixed, but they encompass, I would say, 4 things. Remember that Lenin had put in place the NEP back in 1921, and that had been kind of sorting things out in a way, but it was quite controversial because it was not very Marxist, and by the late 20s it wasn't working too well. So the 4 motivations I would see are personal. The personal motivation of outmaneuvering some of the proponents of the NEP, and particularly Nikolai Bukharin, who was the only real surviving threat of the hierarchy that had been left after Lenin, the collective leadership. And he was very much in favour of the NEP and in favour of considering it. I would say personally that this was kind of a convenient outcome of the change rather than the motivation cause, because Bukharin could have got out of it easily by going along with Stalin. Secondly, ideological. It was certainly an ideological manoeuvre to say, we're dropping the NEP now and going to do something more Marxist. We're going to collectivise the farms and work on heavy industrialisation and have an economy that serves the proletariat. That was much more ideologically defensible than the NEP. And Stalin could also look back and say that Lenin only ever saw the NEP as a temporary thing, and it was temporary, and I backed it whilst it was working. But even Lenin said it was temporary, and now its time has come, it's not working. Again, I think the ideological thing had been so important to Stalin, then he would have gone for this earlier rather than backing the NEP earlier and then switching. So for me, that's not the main motivation. The biggest one for me is the economic advantages. The NEP had worked early in the 20s, but never quite satisfactorily. Exports under the NEP had never exceeded 3 million tonnes of grain, and they're only about a third of their levels in 1930. A third of their levels that they had been in 1913 by 1927. Agriculture hadn't developed really much at all, and there were still 5 million wooden ploughs in Russia at the time, in the Soviet Union, in 1927. And most of the farms were subsistence farms, just growing stuff enough to eat for that family to survive. Restrictions on sales had even meant by the late 1920s that some farmers were feeding grain, which was of low value, to their animals to keep their animals alive, fatten them up, and then selling the animals instead, which were much higher value. Now, of course, that was great for them. It meant more profit, but it meant that there was a restriction on the amount of grain being sold, and that was the staple of many urban dwellers. That, coupled with a poor harvest in 1928, actually ended in grain rationing being introduced in cities. And that, coupled with urban wages having not risen above 1913 levels until 1928 in real terms, and unemployment, poor housing, and rising crime, all of which meant in the cities the NEP was not seen as being the solution, the magic bullet. And so, in 1928, for economic reasons, I think Stalin sees that the time is convenient to move towards a more ideological system. And this has the added benefit, of course, of outmanoeuvring those rivals and sidelining them that want to keep back in the NEP. The other factor to throw in here is also international circumstances. It's already obvious by 1928 that the Soviet Union needs to rearm and be self-reliant, and Stalin is able to tap into nationalism as a way of justifying his 5-year plans. And you see that very much in the 1933 speech, 31 speech on industrialization, where he talks about being behind and being beaten and needing to catch up or being overwhelmed. However, again, I would see that as being a growing motivation of the 5-year plans as you go through the 30s, but in 1928, not so much the one motivation. So for me, it's economic, but other historians are out there and might disagree. So 5-year plans. And the idea of the 5-year plans was to rapidly industrialize the country, and that was going to be paid for, in part at least, by collectivization, which was going to be a more efficient, more effective system of farming and agriculture, which would mean more grain was going to be harvested, and that could be sold abroad to pay for expertise and machinery to bring about the industrialization. It should also be worth mentioning at this stage that 5-year plans is a slight misnomer. They're not really plans so much as a set of targets by Gosplan, and they're fairly sort of arbitrary in terms of their targets. So we're going to think briefly about collectivization, and then we'll whip through the 5-year plans. Collectivization had already been mooted in 1928, but as a voluntary thing. And the plan was, well, there were various forms of it, but the Kolkhots was the most favoured collective farm at this time in the 1930s, where the land would be held in common between 50 to 100 households and run by a committee. Livestock and tools would all be pooled, so there'd be no individual possessions, but individual households would be allowed to keep about an acre or so to grow their own veg on, perhaps keep a couple of animals. The idea is that this would allow for greater mechanisation, and collaboration would allow to greater efficiency, greater yield, and also fewer workers, and that those workers could go off to work in cities. But although it's voluntary in 1928, that as a economic situation deteriorated. In December 1929, Stalin said there's loads of farmers hoarding stuff and refusing to engage, and instead ordered the liquidation of the kulaks. So this was the idea of mass forced collectivization. This led to around 10 million kulaks being sent to kulaks, wealthy farmers, but really anyone could be labelled as a kulak, and probably they're the better farmers as well, because they're the ones that have made a success of their farms. 10 million are sent to labour camps, many of them in Siberia. Lots of people slaughter their animals rather than have them absorbed into the collective. About 18 million horses, 100 million sheep and goats were killed between 1932 and 1933. In fact, the impact of dekulakization is so severe and destructive that in March 1930, Stalin said that people were dizzy with success and called a halt to the process. At that point, collectivization had actually brought together 50% of the farms in the Soviet Union, but through that year, that actually shrinks back to 25%, which again is an indication of how unpopular the whole process was. The second wave of collectivization began in 1931 and actually led to the biggest famine in Russian history, at least 10 million dying, most of them in the Ukraine. And this was the result of the government being unyielding, unbending in its targets. Collectivization between 1928 and 1932 actually saw a reduction in grain yields from 73 million tonnes to 68 million tonnes, but infamously an increase in state procurement of grain from 11 million tonnes to 23 million tonnes, almost more than doubling. And that was used as planned to sell abroad to finance industrialization. Cattle numbers also fell from 71 million in 1928 to 38 million in 1933, roughly halving. The pig population more than half, from 26 million down to 12 million. So pretty poor record really on collectivization. But one upside was that it did lead to an increased urbanization, people leaving the countryside and going to work in towns. The urban population was 18% in 1928, and that had risen to 50% by 1939. And the numbers in cities, not just going to small towns, numbers in cities actually almost trebled in that period from 22 to 63 million. So collectivization achieves kind of what Stalin wants, but at a massive human cost. And you can debate that another time, or we'll talk about change of continuity in the next video, as I said. Quickly then, the 3 5-year plans in this period, or in this period up to the First World War. The first 5-year plan from 1928 to 1932, you'll notice it's only 4 years. Stalin called to halt because he's already finished it early. It focuses on heavy industry. Stalin called heavy industry the basic branches of industry: coal, steel, oil, those sort of things. Actually achieves a 14% per annum growth in the economy, but products were often very low quality, and the numbers that we get of like production are probably not accurate, because people were quite fearful of reporting the accurate figures to Stalin, particularly if they're disappointing. Stalin at this time reintroduced a 7-day working week, so no days off, and very, very limited consumer goods, and all of which means, all of which means that living standards are much lower in the first year 5-year plan. With that in mind, in 1933, the second 5-year plan does have, firstly, a greater sense of realism in the targets, and secondly, a broader focus on consumer goods, but also on electricity and communications. The Moscow Metro is built in this 5-year plan, and the Moscow-Volga Canal for moving things around. It also introduced a measure of incentive for people to work hard. This leads to the Stakhanov movement in 1935. Alexei Stakhanov cut 102 tons of coal in a 5-hour shift. And the normal amount apparently was about 6.5 tons. So it's massive, like massively way better than anyone else had ever done. He's rewarded with 200 rubles instead of the normal 30, an apartment with a telephone, a cinema pass, a place at a holiday resort, hero status. Sorry, you yielding a whole movement, the Stakhanov movement. You can look up other Stakhanovite heroes, and they were like the incentive for people to work hard and be rewarded, which is not particularly communist. 55,000 senior communists also are rewarded and do better at this time too, which leads to a split, of course, in living standards. In 1934, bread rationing did end in this 5-year plan, but the consumer goods boom wasn't really on. 6,000 people apparently queued at one Leningrad shoe shop in 1934 because shoes were such a rare thing and they'd heard that they had them. This is partly because defence spending rose during the second 5-year plan from 4% to up to 17%, because of the growing risk from the Nazis, and that really pinched living standards because consumer goods were directly affected by that change. The third 5-year plan started in 1938 and runs through to June 1941 when the Nazis invade, and there's an obvious focus on rearming there. 9 new aircraft factories were built in that 5-year plan, and one thing to note is that internal passports were reintroduced in 1940, so towards the end of that, because people were moving around more to try and get better jobs and better living conditions, and this put a stop to that, particularly that drift from rural to urban jobs, homes. And of course, the third 5-year plan is impacted by the purges. Lots of managers were shot in that time. So in this period, we do see some impressive improvements in the Soviet economy. Oil production more than doubles from 12 million tons in 1927 up to 26 million tons in 1937. Steel production rising from 3 million tons in 1927 up to 18 million tons in 1937. And even if that's exaggerated, that's still pretty impressive. Coal rose from 35 million tons in 1935 up to 128 million tons in 1937. There's a whole slew of gigantomania, they call it, big sort of successes. Magnitogorsk is built from scratch. The Dnipro Dam, the hydroelectric dam, Chelyabinsk tractor factory is created at this time. The White Sea Canal, and electricity production rises from 18 million kilowatt hours in 1927 up to 90 million in 1940. So a lot of successes to put there, but again, as we go back to, the human cost is huge, as it was in collectivization, and the accuracy of those figures and the quality of what's being produced in many cases was not so great. So that's a quick overview of Stalin's economic policies up to the Second World War. Next time, as I say, we'll consider some of the context of that, how big an impact that had been, and what the policies were through and after the war. Thanks for listening. See you next time.